I wanted to talk a bit about what the UK government is trying to do in terms of rare diseases, and I'm going to start with just some of the background, just again to put it into context. And some people in the audience will know this isn't their real names, but this is two brothers who I met about 8 years ago, something like that, who were absolutely fine with a normal birth and delivery, normal birth weight, but when they got their baby check, they had wobbly eyes. Their eyes were sort of moving all over the place, as it was described. And they were screwing up their lights with the eyes and finding it was really, really hurting a lot. They were diagnosed with a retinal dystrophy of an unknown cause at that point, and then carried on, but had excessive weight gain in childhood and infancy, such that the schools were saying to the parents, "You're overfeeding your child. This is really bad. What are you doing?" And having quite a bit of stigmatisation because of that. And it wasn't obviously connected with the vision problems until they were found to have deafness as well, sensory neural deafness required, and a little bit of learning difficulties as part of it. By the time they got to 10, it was a fatty liver. This is one of those awful stories of a family with a rare disease that the doctors didn't know what it was, weren't able to put the different items together. And I've chosen this one because it links with the subsequent speaker that's following after me, Kay Parkinson, about Alstrom. So these children have got something called Alstrom syndrome, a rare condition described in 1959, but the gene was only identified in 2001. And really available on the NHS from about 2005. And it sort of took that length of time before this condition was put together and the genetic test was able to be found. And the children are now able to come to a multidisciplinary clinic. But the issue of rare diseases like this, that us as health professionals don't easily recognise, was highlighted by Liam Donaldson when he was the Chief Medical Officer back in his annual report in 2009. And he made the really good point, I think, that whatever system in the body you look at, there are people with a rare disease affecting it. And you can see really on this, rare neurological disorders, unusual things affecting 45,000 people in the UK. Rare cancers, another 3,000 people. Rare muscle diseases, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and others, 70,000 people altogether. Metabolic conditions, heart problems, kidney problems, etc. And when you put all those together, it's actually an awful lot of people in the UK, about 1 in 17, or coming up for 3 million people altogether. So although there are lots and lots of rare diseases, probably now over 7,000 rare diseases have been identified, ranging from affecting 1 in 2,000 people to 1 in less than a million. If you put them all together, it's about 5% of or 6% of the UK population. And that's a problem because 50% of these affect children. 80% of them have probably got a genetic basis, so they should be amenable to developing a diagnosis. 40 or 50% of them don't yet have a diagnostic test. And over 90% of them haven't got any cure or any specific treatment for it. And I'm glad about Liam Donaldson for highlighting this issue, because of course all of this engenders costs to the health service, to society, to schools, and missed time off work and missed time for family time. So a big cost to the economy as well. And you have to talk in those terms sometimes to persuade people like the Chancellor of the Exchequer and others to think about putting money into it to bring in business to try and address some of these issues. The impact of this on families was shown very nicely in this poster from Shire, really looking at patient pathways, mainly in the US at that point, but how many times people might have to have a misdiagnosis, how many clinicians they might have to go and visit before they got to a diagnosis. Over 50 or 60% of patients and their carers having depression and stress as part of this, and 5 or more years until a diagnosis could be made altogether. So really emphasising the issue altogether. And then the speaker this morning, Alistair Kent, of course, talked about the work done by Rare Diseases UK and the experiences of rare diseases and what families felt about those in a really landmark report, or a series of reports at that point. But what I took home from those was really that patients and families really did want to take part in research, and they really did want to try and find new treatments, new cures as well. Most families didn't feel they were getting enough information at any stage of this, and most families didn't have access to specialist centres or specialist care, or people that would be able to help with their condition directly. It's been a big problem. Internationally, it's been recognised by the International Rare Diseases Research Collaboration, or Consortium, and this is a group of intergovernmental bodies like the US, China, Russia, etc., the World Health Organization, trying to do something about these rare diseases and aiming to try and develop 200 new treatments for 200 of these by 2020. That's the sort of the catch line from it. This includes new diagnostic tests, really, really important to help with that, as well as new therapies. And really doing very well. I looked on their website about a week ago and they're up to about 193, so they're going to exceed that target, which is actually really, really good. But given that there are over 7,000 rare diseases, it's a drop in the ocean. We've all got to make more work on that. And I put that slide up because that was the initiative for the UK government with the more recent Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, to actually develop a strategy for rare diseases that includes the TRC that I'll talk about. So the UK strategy came out a couple of years ago now, and the key parts of this is it wanted to try and develop a framework to support clinical centres who could offer appointments across different specialties all at the same time. So very much like the rare disease centre that Larissa's talked about is going to be doing. Try and develop better public understanding and knowledge about rare diseases with training programmes as well. But very importantly, try and make the UK an excellent place in translational research. So that means doing trials of new treatments in patients and make the UK as a first choice location. And of course it's phrased like that because it's all partly to do with building the economy as well. And the government really wanted to try and attract pharmaceutical companies into the UK to make it easy to do clinical trials, and then of course benefiting the economy at the same time. So there's always a financial incentive for doing this as well as a moral and an ethical incentive to do so. So Dame Sally Davis set up the National Institute for Health Research Rare Disease Translational Research Collaboration. And she did this it started in actually 2013. She appointed 2 leads, Professor Patrick Chinnery, who was then in Newcastle, a neurology professor, he's now in Cambridge, and John Bradley, who's a renal physician. And they had a budget of about 20 million over 5 years, and there was a competition for different theme leads to cover most specialties to try and lead the development of rare disease research for the UK across these. And there were things like cancer, musculoskeletal, skin, gastrointestinal, and a paediatric cross-cutting one to try and pick up conditions that didn't obviously fit in an organ basis, an organ diagnostic one. And the rationale, as we've said, really what they want to try and do is build personal healthcare, patient care pathways, and attract life sciences industry to the UK as being a good place to do work and business. But what they wanted to do was, rather than actually say they're going to put money and say we're going to create new rare disease centres, they wanted to use the existing research infrastructure they've got. So across the country are things called biomedical research centres, and these are collaborations or conglomerations of researchers. So there's a big biomedical research centre in Cambridge. There's a children's research centre at Great Ormond Street, UCLH, and now there's a biomedical research centre here in Birmingham looking at inflammatory disorders as well. Biomedical research units, so these are slightly smaller versions of that, and clinical research facilities. So these are areas where patients can go and take part in first-in-man studies or early phase studies. Use those collaborations already and try and get them to work together more efficiently so that they can actually see patients, characterise them better, what's called phenotyping, work out the natural histories, and use that information to go to drug companies and pharmaceutical companies and says, we've got really good cohorts here, would you like to try and investigate your new medicine in these patients here and actually support getting these treatments into the formulary so that we can prescribe them. And then the final aspect of this was to try and invest in training, to train the next generation of healthcare professionals, doctors, scientists and other workers in rare diseases, so they understand the new technologies that are needed, like bioinformatics and genomics and things like that. So they've been setting up a national database using something called Open Clinica, which is web-based, and the idea really is that there'll be a central repository where pharmaceutical industries can go and says, oh, I'm working on lysosomal storage disease on this particular type. Where are the patients? How many are there? And what are they like? So the limited shared data set would give the ages and the sexes and the anonymous data about patients and where they are in the NHS, all linked by NHS numbers. A data collection system where at the moment coordinators and doctors are entering this phenotypic information, natural history data, And where they want to get is a system where patients can enter their own data, as is happening a lot, of course, in other parts of the NHS, and really, really important to be able to try and do that. And then, as I said, this summary provided live for industry to look at. The in-depth phenotyping, or looking at the natural history, was trying to get infrastructure to work together. So they selected these 14 or 15 rare disease areas, funded the development of cohorts of patients that could then have detailed blood pressure, blood tests, height, weight, etc., and more intensive investigations, coordinated by one of the centres in one of the cities in the UK, but collecting information from across them, and using common protocols so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Standard operating protocols, standard ways of collecting urine samples or skin samples or things like that that would help for the future. And then the third angle was developing master's courses in genomic medicine. So these are now set up around the country with rare disease modules in, especially trying to get people trained in bioinformatics. So it's that big new technology to deal with all this masses of data that we've got coming through that most of us don't really understand very well, but training the rest of the workforce to be able to understand that. And research training fellowships for scientists who can actually make the basic mechanisms and take a rare disease and say, what's the underlying mechanism and where's this drug target going to come from? So really, really important initiative to do there. We've got two research fellows here in the paediatric theme at the moment. Alison Proster, who's studying children and adults with overgrowth disorders. And Derek Lim, who's here in the audience, is the supervisor, is one of the supervisors for her, who's developing new diagnostic tests for these conditions in the laboratories here in Birmingham, as well as some basic science research about that. And Dr. Ethan Sen, who's looking at resistant nephrotic syndrome. Really, really nice chap. Larissa will know him, I'm sure. You know him well. Based, I think, in Bristol at the moment with Professor Moin Salim. And again, doing some really inspiring work, looking at the underlying mechanisms of this. And there's a lot of industry interest around steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome because there are drug targets identified now, I think, as well, that could be used. So it's really good. These are the theme leads that were appointed. So you can see they're spread much around the country. So John McGrath is based at Guy's and Thomas's and is doing work looking at things like congenital ichthyosis and some epidermolysis bullosa. Adrian Thrasher's quite well known, very well known at Great Ormond Street, doing some fantastic work in terms of stem cells and others in immunological disorders. And you can see the names of most of these others on here as well. So it covers most areas altogether. I was appointed as the paediatric cross-cutting lead on this to try and mop up conditions that didn't easily fit under those other areas. And this was based in the clinical research facility here in Birmingham. And what we tried to do was to pull together the old Medicines for Children Research Network, now the Clinical Research Network, Biomedical Research Centre in London in paediatrics, and as many research active children's doctors as possible to actually advise what are the first diseases to look at, support people applying for funding to get this, and actually try and get the NIHR to work together across the country. And we tried to do that through the UK CRF network to recruit patients in different cities, all according to the same protocol to do that, which has been fun to do. So what about the outputs from this then? Well, over the period of this funding, which is just coming to an end, about 38 cohorts were funded. So these would be 38 rare diseases where funding was given to support developing a cohort where one perhaps didn't exist before or wasn't well developed. 10 industry collaboration partnerships on top. So this was a newer scheme saying research could go, I've got this really interesting cohort and I found a research company, Alexion or whoever it's going to be, who's really interested in this condition. Could we apply for this amount of money and could the pharmaceutical company contribute this much and then we'll support that. And these have been a very successful way of going and they've been particularly attractive to companies where there's a drug just on the horizon that's almost ready to go into clinical practice, but they need a bit more information about patient-relevant outcomes. So that's a really good scheme that I think is going to go forward into the future. 12 fellowships, so PhD research training fellowships and some postdoctoral fellowships. And certainly up to June, when I last looked, and it's now above that, there's about 11,000 participants in the UK. So really good numbers actually involved in this around the country, across these areas. The database is progressing. The Open Clinica, led by Roger James in Cambridge, has been set up. It's web-based. And a lot of these cohorts are now putting information in a standardised format. And they're trying to use The same sort of terminologies as is used in the 100,000 Genome Project, things like phenotypes that are being used, moving away from ICD-10 codes into the more updated versions. And Peter Robinson, who was based in Berlin and now going to North America, has been heavily involved in supporting that, which I think has been good. There's been a lot of feedback from patients and researchers about concerns about putting any patient identifiers on our central web repository because of the potential risk of hacking or effects for confidentiality. So that hasn't gone ahead at the moment. So we're trying to resolve really how to include identifiers without compromising patient confidentiality. So at the moment, no patient identifiable data is held on this register. And I think that's going to stay that way because that's what the way the voice is going. Summary data is now available on the TRC website now for some of these conditions so that they can see what cohorts are funded and where the lead research centre is for that as well. So we've got that. The phenotyping is going on nicely, and I've shown this already. These are the cohorts that involve children, which is a big part of it. So you can see variable immunodeficiency, dermatomyositis, myotonic and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, osteogenesis imperfecta is on there somewhere, cystic fibrosis as well, nephrotic syndrome. So quite a spread across different specialties and different areas to try and capture as much as possible that's relevant for patients that can be used. You see. And in the capacity part, as I said, several people have been appointed in the computational biology field to actually train up and develop much better variant analysis than we've been able to have in the UK before that we need for this. Justine Hill has been fantastic. She's just finished, I think, hasn't she, with your team, sadly, but she did an absolutely great job pulling together the patients and has been to Birmingham on several of our rare disease days over the past. Really trying to get patient representatives engaged in these cohorts, advising about how to collect information, and most importantly, putting together patient-relevant outcomes. And I didn't appreciate the importance of this until we went to the European Medicines Agency, protocol assistance, with a proposal for a study where the outcome was going to be a measurement of serum P21 CYP protein that nobody's ever heard of, which we thought was really, really good. And they said, forget that. The only point about having an outcome measure if it's relevant for patients. Otherwise, there's no point in having it. And this is the sort of work that Justine has been involved in with patients and families and cohorts, thinking about what do they want out of a clinical trial, what's going to be important for them to show that a trial works or not. And I think that's been really, 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 really helpful. Also preparing statements on patient data and how it should be used. And again, guardians of confidentiality and what patients are happy to have included and what not. And representation of a lot of rare disease events. And there was a lovely public invasion event in London, I think last week as well, wasn't there, that was very successful, that some people went to. So that's been involved in having a number of different patient rare disease days around the country here that's been very helpful to hold. How are we going to know whether this works or not? I think as a government initiative it's very important to think this is all taxpayers' money, and so we want to know how are we going to assess whether this works. Well, the government has set some targets for it, and they see this £20 million as pump priming. And what they're looking at, they'll say it's successful if it's generated at least as much money through industry in terms of clinical trials coming to the UK and trials of new treatments coming here as well. So one measure that was looked at really is additional funding to the rare disease infrastructure, how that's coming. And I think it's actually developed more than that. Looking at the studies and the total value, it's easily repaid its investment in the first place from the studies that have been supported in the industry involvement, which has been fantastic. How much is the clinical data linking to the genotyping data? That's work in progress at the moment, partly because of the 100,000 Genome Project and getting genomic information through, and partly trying to standardise clinical information that's collected. Because obviously some cohorts we've collected information for 10 years in paper records and old-fashioned ways, and it's quite an investment to get that all electronic and put on big databases. So that's still ongoing to try and link up the clinical information with the genetic. How will the BRCs, BRUs and CRFs come together? They have come together, but I think all of us who work in these areas recognise there's more that can be done. We don't always work as closely as we should be doing. And the latest scheme from the government to renew biomedical research centres has got specific rare disease sections in it saying what efforts are you going to do to work with your colleagues in London or Sheffield or Leeds or somewhere around the country. So that is definitely getting better with a good push from the government to do that. How well is the NIHR working with industry? I'd be very interested to know about industry partners' views on that. From the NIHR point of view, I've seen that they've made efforts to try and streamline some of it and reduce some of the red tape, which I think we all recognise as being a hold-up for that. And Jonathan Sheffield and others have worked really hard to try and reduce the time to first patient recruited and time to target as well on the NHS side. So I think, Larissa, you probably agree with me, we've got a way to go, yes, but I think it's, we're hoping it's going to improve. What the effect of Brexit's going to do with that, I don't know, because obviously then we're going to be presumably losing some European regulation and having to develop some of our own. So that's a big unknown as to how that's going to work. How much is it benefiting patients? Well, I've seen some very clear examples from the Cambridge Rare Disease Symposium Day in September. Some lovely examples of where patients have benefited from treatments coming in. But there's always a long time lag with this, and this has only been going about since 2013, so about 3 years really, I suppose. And to get that benefit always, sadly, takes longer than we would hope for. And then finally, how well are patients engaged? I think it's been great, but I think we're always asking patients to do more, get more engaged on top of already difficult situations, managing difficult conditions, and having to first and foremost look after their child and the other members of the family as well. And I think we have to be careful not to overburden families as well. We must engage patients and offer that opportunity all the time to do that, and then listen to the patients when they give us their opinions as well, which I think is happening. But it's just trying to get the balance right for families for that as the issue. Where's the future going? Well, as I understand it, funding has been confirmed for another 5-year tranche, and it's going to be distributed through biomedical research centres. And these are NHS research centres in most of the major cities in the UK. So that's good at the moment. The clinical research facilities will be involved in delivering early phase clinical trials. What we have to try and do somehow is realise and accept that not everybody with a rare disease lives in a big city, and that we need somehow to get equality of access to children and adults with a rare disease to take part in studies, whether they live in London or they live in the Isles of Scilly. It doesn't matter, they should still somehow have access to do that. And it's up to us as health professionals and pharmaceutical industry and things as to how we develop a network, an outreach network where people can take part wherever they are in the country. So I think that's crucial. There's going to be new competitions for funding. I think the most likely route is going to be with industry collaboration. So this is a great opportunity to encourage us to partner with our industry colleagues. I think that's really, really exciting. And that will probably include in the future training posts, PhD studentships and research fellowships as well as part of that. So I think it's a really exciting time. I'm really glad of what the government is doing with this, and I'm glad about their commitment to take this forward in the future as well. But it means there's no let up. We've all got to carry on working hard to try and take this forward if we can. And with that, I think this comment at the bottom is most important here. Make the voices of children with rare diseases heard, and I think that sums it up really what to do. Thank you very much. Thank you.